Hey guys, welcome back to the video. I'm Luke, an ACA qualified accountant, having passed all 15 of my ACA exams at the first attempt while studying at a Big Four firm. And after my time at the Big Four, I transitioned into a career within investment banking, and I now spend my days helping current candidates smash their exams. And in today's video, we're going to discuss the certificate level Principles of Tax exam. We're going to run through some advice and some tips to help you guys ace that paper. Principles of Tax is a certificate level exam, and it's considered the introductory tax exam on the ACA qualification. So it's one of the more straightforward tax exams you're going to encounter, and it's a precursor to the likes of tax compliance, which you sit at the professional level, and also the infamous business planning tax, which also comes at the later stages of the professional level. Not everyone studies towards BPT or business planning tax, but the majority of the ACA candidates do sit it. If you don't sit BPT, then you're only going to be sitting 2 tax exams on your ACA journey, but the overwhelming majority of candidates do sit Principles of Tax, tax compliance, and then BPT. So yeah, that's a hell of a lot of tax to learn. The fundamentals of taxation are all covered in the Principles of Tax exam at the certificate level. Everything you learn in this module is just a precursor to what's to come down the line in the more challenging tax exams like tax compliance and BPT. Therefore, it's so important to develop a deep understanding of taxation principles at this level, because it's only going to get tougher from here. Doing well at this level and in this particular exam is going to set you up really nicely to be able to thrive at the professional level, because in my opinion this exam isn't that tough, but the professional level tax exams are on a different level. Tax compliance is hard, but BPT is arguably the most challenging and difficult exam on the qualification. So if you can do well here, it'll give you a leg up for the professional level. For that reason, do not take Principles of Tax lightly. Even if you're finding it quite straightforward as you go through the workbook, make sure you're competent, because all of this material is going to rear its head again once you get to tax compliance and BPT. So learn the basics now, really develop a deep understanding for the content, because you're going to need to recall everything you learn here at the next level of the qualification. And the pass rate for this exam is around the 90% mark, so candidates do well when it comes to this exam. It sits somewhere in the middle of the difficulty spectrum, I would say, on the certificate level. It's certainly nowhere near as challenging as something like an accounting, but I would argue it's more straightforward than a business technology finance. So it's somewhere in the middle. It's not the easiest exam you're going to encounter, but it's certainly not the hardest exam. The exam has 42 questions in total, and it's structured into 2 sections. 40 of the questions that you need to address are multi-choice questions, and this comprises 80% of the marks in the paper. And you also need to answer 2 scenario-based questions, which are worth 20% of the marks. One scenario-based question will require you to prepare an income tax computation, and the second scenario-based question will require you to prepare a corporation tax computation. So each scenario-based question is worth 10% of the marks. And in this video, I'm going to walk through some tips and some advice to help you get ready and prepare for your Principles of Tax exam. These tips helped me when I was preparing for the exam, back when I was studying towards the qualification, because when I sat the exam, I had absolutely no background in tax. I'd never encountered the idea of taxation before, so I was a complete newbie to the topic. I had no experience with personal taxation, corporation tax, so the advice I'm going to share would have been a massive help to me when I was studying towards the exam. So yeah, let's get started. My first piece of advice when it comes to doing well in the Principles of Tax certificate level exam is to get comfortable with tax administration questions. So administrative points make up around 20% of the marks in the Principles of Tax exam, and by tax administration, I mean questions focused on things like tax filing and payment dates, fines and penalties for missing tax deadlines, things like this, the more administrative side of tax. There is a lot of marks going for these types of questions. A lot of this information can actually be found within the tax tables that you can access within the software during your exam. But what I would say is that this exam can be pretty time pressured. It's quite difficult to get everything done within the 90 minutes. So do try and memorize as much of the easy and straightforward information as you can, because it will save you time in the exam. You won't have to look at the software, you will have committed it to memory. Do try and remember and recall the easy to remember dates and penalties and those administrative points that come up time and time again in the question bank and in mock exam papers, because it will save you time in the real exam. Only refer to the tax tables for data points that are more challenging to remember. It's quite boring and dull to spend a lot of your revision phase trying to remember and retain a lot of tax admin, but it will serve you well in the real exam. Time is of the essence. You only have 90 minutes to complete this paper. You've got 2 scenario-based questions that you need to complete during that time. So you need to be either very comfortable locating that information in the tax tables in the software, or commit some of those basic points to memory so you don't need to look them up in the actual exam. A large number of candidates that fail principles of tax do have a solid grounding in the core tax principles. They can do the calculations, they have a really solid grasp of how to calculate income tax, national insurance, corporation tax and capital gains, but they neglect the tax administration side of the exam. And you can't really do that as it makes up such a large proportion of the marks. 20% is too significant a weighting to neglect. You have to be comfortable with that section of the material because it's such a large weighting. I know it's a pain and I know it's boring and I know you don't want to learn it, but it's something you just have to do. If you can get your head around tax admin, then you can consider it a free and easy 20 marks. And if you can get 18, 19, 20 marks from admin, then you're well on your way to achieving the 55% pass mark. My second tip when it comes to doing well in principles of tax is effectively an extension of my first tip, and that is to leverage the tax information in the software. The exam software, thankfully, includes tax tables built into the functionality, so you can access all of the current year tax rates and other helpful open book information. The functionality within the software allows you to generate tax tables, which contains a lot of helpful information that will allow you to address questions that you're going to face in the exam. And this is super helpful because at the certificate level, you're not allowed to take in any open books or permitted texts. But this all changes at the professional level when you're allowed to take in anything you like. You aren't allowed to take in anything to the Principles of Tax exam, but the software does include a link to a tax table pop-up, which contains a ton of information which you can access and will help address a lot of the questions in the exam. So the key point is don't forget to use the tax tables that you're provided with in the exam if you run into trouble on a question. I thankfully passed the Principles of Tax exam at the first attempt, but I completely forgot to use the tax tables. I forgot that they were there. So thankfully I passed, but it was lucky because I didn't even know that the tax tables existed and that you could access them within the software. But now you do, so you can absolutely use them if you forget your income tax rate, your corporation tax rate, etc. What I would say as a caveat is that you shouldn't let the tax tables slow you down in the exam. You should be knowing a lot of your headline tax rates like the back of your hand, because you'll be doing so much question practice applying and recalling these headline tax rates. So you should be able to memorize them just by a function of doing tons of question practice. You should be knowing things like your income tax rates, your dividend tax rates, corporation tax rates, CGT tax rates off by heart. But if you do forget them in the exam, then you can fall back and rely on the tax tables to remember them. So in an ideal world, you shouldn't be going into the tax tables to pull out the headline tax rates, but you can go in if you have a complete mind blank. My third tip when it comes to doing well on the Principles of Tax exam is to read the exam questions carefully. Now, in the Principles of Tax exam, the examiners are going to be working super hard to try and catch you out with odd or niche tax rules or quirks, particularly in the multi-choice section of the exam. So it's important to spend an adequate amount of time reading the question thoroughly and being completely clear on what you need to do and what question you're answering before you start attacking it. Do jot down any tax quirks that you spot when you're reading the question for the first time, just so you don't lose sight of it and you don't forget about it when you're answering the question. The examiners will try and catch you out here. It's one of those exams where I definitely spot awkwardly worded questions regularly. The examiners are trying to misdirect you, throw you off. It can be so easy to misread or misinterpret a key date or tax implication within a question. There are so many tax rules covered in the ACA syllabus that it's so easy to get in a tangle and mix up your tax rules, mix up your tax rates. So look out for questions that are worded in a confusing way and are trying to catch you out. My advice, if you're struggling to memorize all of the different tax rules, treatments and quirks on the principles of tax syllabus, then practice by doing questions. Question practice is going to be the best way to get to grips with the material, the rules, the quirks as quickly as possible. Do the question bank as many times as you possibly can before going into the exam, because the more questions you attempt before you walk into the exam, the more exposure you have to the different types of tax rules and tax treatments that are tested on the syllabus. If you are feeling a bit overwhelmed with the sheer volume of information that you're presented with on the principles of tax syllabus, I would emphasize the importance of question practice to get a good grasp of how the examiner is going to test all this information on exam day. If you're making mistakes, you can identify your mistakes and use the mark scheme to understand exactly how you should be attacking the question that you're getting wrong. And then you can remedy your errors and be better prepared for the sort of questions that you're going to face on exam day. My fourth piece of advice when it comes to doing well on the principles of tax exam is to understand basis periods. Now, at the certificate level, basis periods are deemed to be one of the more challenging concepts within the tax syllabus. But when you get to the professional level, basis periods are assumed to be quite basic knowledge. So it's important to get a good grounding of how basis periods work, how you apply them at the certificate level, because the concept's only going to be built upon and expanded upon at the professional level when you walk into tax compliance and business planning tax. Basis periods describe how your tax years and your accounting or financial years interrelate. Basis periods contain a ton of rules. You have your opening year, your closing year rules, etc. It can all be quite overwhelming at first, but how I get my head around basis periods is always by sketching out a timeline. Even in the real exam, even today when I'm teaching basis periods to candidates, I always draw out a timeline to illustrate how the timing of a financial year relates to the timing of a tax year. You draw out the timing of the financial year above and you draw out the timing of the tax year below. This really helps you compare and understand how the two year ends interrelate. So it's much easier to answer questions by visualizing basis periods if you draw out a timeline rather than just doing it all in your head. I've always found that visualizing basis periods makes everything make sense. When you're in the exam under time pressure, don't do it all in your head. Get out the scrap piece of paper and just sketch everything out. It makes everything much clearer. By the end of Principles of Tax, I felt like I'd mastered the concept of basis periods. So if you are someone that struggles with the concept, make sure you sketch them out. Every time you answer a question, just sketch out your accounting year, sketch out your tax year, and keep attacking questions until you've got a much firmer grasp on the concept. My penultimate piece of advice when it comes to doing well in the Principles of Tax exam is to not neglect ethics during your revision phase. You need to make sure you're dedicating enough time to the ethics component of the syllabus during your studying. And I always say this for every tax exam you face, because ethics within tax is very standardized. The topics that you see tested in this area of the curriculum are tested over and over again. It's always the same across the three exams: Principles of Tax, Tax Compliance, BPT. The ethics material remains constant. The ethics questions are super repetitive. You see the same concepts tested time and time again: under-reporting of tax, tax evasion, avoidance, money laundering. These are all of the major ethics ideas and concepts that come up time and time again, so make sure you're prepared for all of them before you walk into your exam. Ethics makes up a pretty significant proportion of the Principles of Tax exam, so you need to make sure you are comfortable with all the different types of ethics questions that you could be tested on. It makes up 7 to 10% of the syllabus, so it's pretty material. You need to make sure you're ready for ethics-based questions on the day. Make sure you know how to respond to different types of ethical threats, who you would inform, who you would not inform. Keep focusing on all those different types of questions. Complete that section of the question bank because it's going to come up, it's going to be tested heavily. If you've done enough work on ethics, I think you'll be well positioned to do well in the exam. My final piece of advice when it comes to doing well in the Principles of Tax exam is to leave the two scenario-based questions until last. As I said at the top of the video, you're presented with two scenario-based questions which combined make up 20% of the weighting of the Principles of Tax exam. Each question represents 10%. You have a scenario-based question that requires you to complete an income tax computation, and the second scenario-based question requires you to complete a corporation tax computation. And in terms of how the exam is ordered chronologically, the first two questions you'll be presented with in the paper are the two scenario-based questions, and that will be followed by the 40 multi-choice questions. It can be incredibly daunting to open an exam and be presented with two long-form scenario-based questions, particularly when you're quite nervous going into the exam. My personal preference when it comes to principles of tax is always to do the MCQs first and then go back to the scenario-based questions at the end once you've got the distraction of the MCQs out of your mind. I always found it mentally much easier to start with the MCQs, as each question is very short, easy to read and easy to get through, and then you can build up your confidence as you go. So by the time you've got to the scenario-based questions, hopefully you're feeling like you've built up a bit of momentum. Getting the MCQs done first will make you feel much more confident going into the scenario-based question because you have already completed 80% of the exam by the time it comes to address the scenarios. Typically, the candidates that fail the Principles of Tax exam start with the scenario-based question, spend far too much time on it, and run out of time to complete the MCQs. In my experience, candidates that start with the MCQs do much better than candidates that start with the scenario-based questions. It's far easier to manage your timings, I find, if you start with the MCQs. So my advice is focus on the MCQs first and tackle the larger scenario-based questions at the end once you've completed those MCQs. Cool, so that's my tips and my advice for passing the Principles of Tax exam at the first attempt. Hopefully that was all helpful. This is likely going to be the first tax exam that you encounter on your ACA qualification, so there's going to be a lot of new concepts that you need to get familiar with. It's quite a time-pressured exam, so you need to make sure you've done ample amounts of question practice before you walk into the exam on exam day, and make sure you've done mock exams under timed exam conditions too, just to make sure you've got experience with what that 90-minute time frame looks like. The pass rates are high, so do take confidence in that. The majority of candidates that do sit this exam do pass it, but it's important to build up the knowledge now and really work hard towards this exam, because all of this knowledge is just going to come back and be assumed knowledge at the professional level. If you enjoy quantitative questions and maths, numbers-based questions, then I think you're going to like this exam. I remember I did when I sat it. It's very maths heavy and very quantitative, so if you do enjoy maths-based exams as opposed to qualitative-based exams, then I think you're going to do well here. If you did enjoy the video and found it helpful, please feel free to smash the like button and consider subscribing. I'm making tons of videos in regards to the ACA qualification, and I'm making courses for each of the 15 exams, so it'd be great to have you on board for this journey. And if you do have the exam coming up, I wish you the best of luck for it. You're going to absolutely smash it, and I'll see you guys in the next video.